You're listening to Natural Resources University. In this podcast network, our hosts are university researchers and extension specialists, opening your gateway to the science of natural resource management.
Welcome to Deer University, the podcast of the Mississippi State University Deer Lab. I'm Bronson Strickland.
And I'm Steve Damaris. We're both lifelong hunters, deer biologists, professors of wildlife management, and co-directors of the MSU Deer Lab. We explain the latest research, including our own work and that conducted elsewhere.
So if you're interested in deer biology and management, this is your podcast. Every decision you make is a step in your management program, and we give you the knowledge to make every decision count.
Welcome back to Deer University. We have a special show today because we're talking with one of our alums from the MSU Deer Lab, Jacob Dykes, and of course our old friend and colleague at the University of Florida, Marcus Lashley, and Bronson and I, as usual.
And I brought a buddy along with me, you see here.
Yes, and that's probably the only closest you're going to get to that kind of deer, probably, is having a looking over your shoulder.
Except when I visit a taxidermist, probably so.
Well, Jacob had a really interesting project designed to answer a couple of questions that we get asked a lot at Bronson, in particular, as the extension specialist here, is what do I plant for my deer? And there's so many ways you could answer that, and Marcus, when he was here and worked, the three of us worked together to develop this project for Jacob to try to answer that question. And Jacob, you want to kind of give us an introduction to a broad picture of what you did?
Absolutely. So we set out with two questions. What do deer eat, and why do they eat that? And one thing that I've always thought was really cool about the project is we wanted to be able to connect with hunters. So one thing that we did was we used the same forages that are being planted in food plots, So we chose 15 of your more popular food plot forages, several different clovers. We had some turnips, rape. We had Austrian winter peas. If it's in a food plot in the southeast, we had it. And another cool thing about the project is nothing fancy. You went straight to the co-op, as any hunter would do. And we purchased it and amended the soil and tilled the land just like anybody would on a regular weekend preparing their food plots. So, we planted big plots of these. So 15 different forages, kind of side by side, same size plots, and protected them with electric fencing, let them all establish. And then went in and did some really cool stuff, monitoring how these deer were navigating the food plots, what they were eating, when they were eating them, things like that. So got some really cool stuff out of it.
One of the things that I found particularly fascinating about this is, we're all hunters, right? And we're all interested in which food plot planting is best for our situation. And I certainly get asked that plenty as well from our constituents. But we also had a really fundamental ecological, biological question related to the animals that we could ask in a way that we could not only try to answer this question about what's best to plant, but also try to understand, what's driving animals to select the way that they do. It's just a beautiful design to integrate those two things, and it was really fascinating to me because of that.
Yeah, we compared these different forages, but then at the same time, we kind of wanted to see, what the nutrients within these forages. How are these deer navigating these different forages? And is it static? Or are they changing over time? And the way it was designed was beautiful. We were able to do a lot of cool stuff. It turned out great.
And without getting into the many details, it was designed experimentally in the right way so that we could control what we needed to control and really focus on the key questions. What types of nutrients are the deer searching for when they choose what to eat?
So that's a good point, Jacob, is someone could ask, why the heck did you fence deer out at some certain time? You're trying to figure out what deer select and you've got them excluded. So walk us through what our rationale was for temporarily excluding deer.
I think that was probably one of the most important things we could have done with the project, because if nothing else, your different forages are going to grow at different rates. Some are available, whereas others are just now trying to pop out of the ground. So that was one thing that we really had to control for. So using those electric fences, keeping these deer out, allowed all of these forages to become established. So they were all available when we wanted to see what deer were going to choose to eat. Without those electric fences, I assume that maybe they would have started with what was available and just moved on down the line. So I think that was a really important part of the project.
Yeah, I can.
Go ahead, Marcus.
Sorry. I can second that, Jacob. That was a clever part of the design, I think, that we came up with, and it was absolutely necessary. And people might think, well, of course, the late season stuff may have performed better than the early season stuff. You fenced them out of it when it was good, but you're right. You can't compare selection of forages when one isn't available, right? So we wanted to let them all get established. And really what was driving your question was a little bit more broad than just which forage is best, right? You were actually tracking the nutrients in it. And I think you're going to get to that, but I think that's an interesting aspect, as like you said, and we have in the video on Facebook on both the Deer Lab Facebook pages that we're going to launch with this. People can visualize that change in the forages, but that was an important aspect with your design, because we could basically make each of the plots of 15 forages available for a short time period to select, and then do that over time so that we sort of rearrange which one has the most nutrients in it. So it's a pretty cool design.
Yeah, absolutely. The big question we had was not necessarily the focus of the forage, but the nutrition within that forage, the different nutrients, which is kind of the basis. These animals are eating because they need these nutrients. So that was kind of the big question. But secondarily, even with those fences, it was neat to be able to compare how these food plot forages are going to grow, and that can be directed at what time of the year are you hoping to be on your food plot. So it allowed us to assess these different forages, but also get to our point. And we had to keep them out of there for a little while at least.
So we ended up with kind of an overlap of, and in very general terms here, we typically think of, strategies for setting up a food plot, again, to see deer and to harvest deer and to also provide nutrition, is that our cereal grains or our grasses typically respond first. Those are really good for bow hunters. 2 weeks after you get it in the ground, and adequate rainfall, soil moisture, they're popping out. But it takes a little bit longer for these clovers to develop. It's a smaller seed, takes longer to get a root system developed, and so we had to find kind of that overlap where the cereal grains were there and available and still had high diet quality or nutrient concentration, as well as in the same space and same time the clovers were available, because I don't mean to belabor this point, but all of us have heard this time and time again. You get up and you're on stage and you're talking about a particular forage, and someone says, well, I think that particular forage, and I'm thinking of one in particular, and I'm not going to say it. This particular forage, I know it's really good because I've seen deer eating it. And my response is, well, number one, in the annual cycle, the time of the year, it may be the only thing available. And then also, it may be the only forage you have on your property. So you can't gauge the value of a deer forage if it's the only forage a deer has to choose from. So hence our buffet design, where we tried to create literally a buffet. Same place, same time, turn to your left, turn to your right. Here are 15 forages growing, high nutrient concentration, and let the deer choose which they want.
Yeah, that's an excellent point.
And one other aspect of that buffet is, you go to a buffet restaurant and they have the meats together and they have the vegetables together and they have the salad, but we randomized so that the salad wasn't all together and the meats weren't all together. It was totally randomized, so there's no bias because, well, they ate this forage because it happened to be next to this other forage that they really liked, and it was consistent, always paired together. It wasn't that way. It was randomized and spatially replicated, 8 times, Jacob?
Yes, we had 8 blocks. So each one of these blocks had each of the 15 forages. And we did, all of the blocks were randomized because we wanted to control for things like, okay, well, this is closer to the woods, to cover. So they just seem safer here. So we didn't want to put the same forage on the outside each time. So for each one of these blocks, we completely randomized everything.
And there were long linear plots too. So talking about closer to the woods, I mean, there were woods close to all of those 15.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. They were all in very similar areas across our study area. But yeah, we wanted to randomize to control, make sure we didn't, put one right beside the high trafficked deer trail going through the property or something like that. So I thought that was an important thing we did there too. So.
Yeah, so they were all adjacent to cover. I mean, I think that is really important. It wasn't set up to where a particular forage was 100 yards away from cover and a particular forage was adjacent. It was set up horizontally adjacent to the cover, so they all were equidistant to the cover. And then also, Marcus made a really good call on this too, is having a control where nothing was planted in a particular plot to serve as a baseline. Another thing you did, Jacob, I thought was important was we didn't just measure. Well, let me let you answer that. How did you measure the response? What was it that you tallied whereby we considered a deer liked this forage or not? How did you measure it?
So I actually had 2 ways to measure that. So when we got ready to run these trials, I went into each one of these forages on the blocks that we were going to use for that particular trial. We ended up with 6 trials. So say for trial 1, I went to the 2 blocks that I was going to use, and these were randomized as well. We didn't just use the closest 2 blocks or anything like that. So we selected which 2 we were going to use. I went into each of the plots and I took a sample. I wanted to know how much biomass was there, and I wanted to know how much biomass had been removed after the completion of that particular trial. So I went in, took a sample, also set up cameras. These cameras were motion activated on each plot. Each plot had its own camera. We went in and we dropped the fences. So we were monitoring consumption before and after, or after consumption, and then also we had the cameras rolling. So what we did is, of course, we got tons of pictures of deer, but to kind of wean through those, we considered that deer foraging in that particular plot when we had pictures of its head down actually eating. So we had snapshots that we were able to go through and this deer head down in the forage eating. And that's kind of how we tallied of, how much a particular plot was being used.
One thing that I love about this study and the way that we were evaluating these forages is, there's a lot of really great information out there on food plot and comparing their productivity, but there's not very much comparing them on what we all care about, or at least what I care about. I want to know which one the deer like to eat most, right? That's the one I want to plant on my place. Which one do they eat the most? All of them are really productive. They can produce a lot of biomass, especially if you do a soil test and amend the soils correctly and all the things, the weather and everything goes right. They can be really productive, but this study we were actually seeing which ones do they like and let the deer tell us that based on which ones they eat the most of. So I really like that aspect. That's what I, at the end of the day, wanted to know personally. Which one did the deer prefer?
And that inquisitive nature that you have so strongly, Marcus, and all of us have as scientists and deer nuts is also not just which one did they eat, but why.
Exactly.
And that's the really cool part of this study that you created, is not just which ones, but why.
Right, and I think that was kind of what we've kind of been bouncing around. The reason that Jacob measured all those things, the reason, what was it, like 15 nutritional things about the plant, right, Jacob? It was something like that.
Yeah, we had 14 different nutrients, minerals, everything.
Right, so a full nutritional array of the plants, basically anything you could get for a forage at a lab. And you basically were trying to predict which ones they would choose based on the nutritional content. And then in your design, when each block the fences got dropped at a different time, cereal rye, the nutritional quality in trial 1 is not the same as it was in trial 6, right? And neither was it for any other forage. So we're sort of basically setting up this design where you have nutrients that are in these plants that deer are selecting, and then we're rearranging how they're ordered in the plants over and over, and then monitoring what deer do. So you're essentially able to figure out what in the plants is driving the deer to want it at a given time, which I think is just an awesome thing. And maybe I'm just a deer nut and inquisitive as a scientist, but I really feel like our listeners want to know that very thing as well.
Yeah, I may be a little biased too, but I agree. It was awesome. We had the cameras out the entirety of the trial, taking pictures day, night, anytime an animal walked in front of this. So what we were able to get from that was how much are they using this one versus this one versus this one. So then we take samples before the trial and send these off for nutritional analysis. So now we know how much they're using each of them. We also know the nutritional composition of each of them. So, on this part of the project, you kind of forget it's not about the forage. It's about the nutritional makeup of that forage. You know what I mean? So it's about the ingredients, no longer about that particular plant. So when we put all that together, yeah, we were absolutely able to predict and see what these animals were actually chasing or pursuing, per se. So, and that was another really cool aspect of the project was, because we were doing these trials at different times, you had a great point, Marcus. A forage during trial 1 did not have the same nutritional composition as it did in, say, trial 3 or 5. Same plant, but as they continue to grow and go through their life cycle, they're steadily changing nutritional composition. So again, that was an important aspect of the project that let us see what these animals were pursuing and not necessarily just eating the same forage in each trial. And it was apparent that that's not what was happening.
As wildlife biologists, we often talk about protein requirements of animals, protein requirements or production by the plants, and that's a really important variable. But you didn't stop there, and that allowed you to look more fine-tuned and kind of run through the different variables you monitored in the vegetation.
Okay, so I'm going to keep talking about how cool I think this project is. But so here's another aspect that I thought was just awesome. It was brilliant. Was we kind of went into this, and a lot of the idea, at least with me, was like, okay, well, these animals are maximizing. They're trying to get as much as they can of certain nutrients or all the nutrients. So one idea that we had was, okay, well, what if too much of a good thing is a bad thing? So one thing we wanted to look at was, okay, are they avoiding nutrients? A certain nutrient, which is something I had never even considered. So when we went in here, we took these samples and we sent them off, and we measured everything from protein to phosphorus to calcium to sulfur. I mean, if we could test for it, we did, and that was what kind of unique about this project is similar things have been done, but usually you're only paying attention to like crude protein or phosphorus. Well, if you're not considering all of them, it's hard to pinpoint which one may be actually having an effect. So we tested for everything. We wanted to know everything about a particular plant when we sent it off to get sampled. So that's exactly what we did.
Yeah, and to add to that, Jacob, one of the things that I think we've all struggled with as researchers, when you go into the literature, the results are inconsistent. Right, you see one study and they're showing that these animals are trying to maximize this one nutrient. And then there were some other studies right about the time you came on to work on this project showing in a different species of ungulate that actually the diet selection was being driven by avoiding things that could be toxic. And then, that when you go and actually start looking through the literature, and not just with white-tailed deer, but start looking at a lot of different kinds of deer, the results are always really inconsistent. Sometimes they show they're maximizing, sometimes they show nothing, sometimes they show that they're minimizing. I think this design and the fact that you did this full nutrient array was really important because it allowed you to kind of ask all those questions simultaneously.
Yeah, and that was another reason that we chose 15 forages too, is we wanted to make sure that we had a full array of nutrients offered. So, we had 15 different forages, and then also, you're right, you get into the literature and it can be a little confusing, but it guides what you need to do next. And then we thought it was important that we consider everything that we could consider. So that's what we went with.
One thing that might help people understand this a little bit better, and this is an oversimplification, but I think it translates okay, is what we do all the time with the nutrient. An essential nutrient that all humans have to have is salt, sodium. And we have just like a deer or an animal, we kind of have this immediate feedback where we can be overwhelmed with salt. And we might have this feedback that goes over minutes or up to an hour where I've had too much salt. So you could have the exact same food that you might be craving initially, but it has the addition of this other nutrient to where I can't have any more. That's too much. And that was kind of our underlying hypothesis with this as well, is that deer have this nutritional feedback system, this loop, where circulating in their system is this baseline level need and craving for nutrients, while simultaneously having to buffer some others that they may have too much of, or even borderline a toxicity. And this varies. This again, I hate to have a little bit of a spoiler alert here, but this is why we can't say there is no perfect forage for all deer at all places at all time. There's individual variation, deer to deer. There's temporal variation, time of day, time of year, based on their needs. And there's spatial variation, which is something, Jacob, you brought up in this. What is your habitat? What is the baseline levels that these deer have in their system based on what the naturally occurring plants are providing could shift what deer are selecting for in these food plots.
Yeah, and to add to that, Bronson, when I go back and think about this before we did the experiment, and, we kind of have, everybody I think does this to some degree, but I certainly did. I was like, man, there's got to be a forage that's the silver bullet. Right? But let's think about that from a human nutrition standpoint. I mean, we have access to whatever food we want, pretty much. Like I can go down to the store and get just about anything I want right now, and I'm not limited, and I'm lucky for that. But my point of that is, I love eating backstrap from a deer. That's one of my favorite things on the planet, and I'm not resource limited to eat that, but I still don't eat it for every meal. That's kind of the take home. Why do you, if you love salad, why do you not eat that for every single meal? Like, we still, even us have this innate feedback system like you're talking about, where we know that we need to vary our diet, and the idea that deer wouldn't need to vary their diet and there would be some one thing that we could plant for them is kind of silly when you start thinking about it that way.
It really
Absolutely.
is. Why do we assume deer don't have cravings like we have cravings?
Guys, I think we've pretty much established this is a brilliantly designed study. Jacob, why don't you tell us, what did you learn?
Well, we just kind of alluded to that, and believe me, I looked and looked. I thought I was going to come out of here and be able to say, look, this is what you need to plant. This is when you need to plant it, and this is going to, fit all your needs. But we learned the opposite, actually. So these animals have a bunch of, just like us, they have a bunch of nutrients, and they've got to meet those requirements. No one thing is going to do that for them. So they got to mix and match, and they got to stay away from getting too much of anything and trying to get enough of everything. So it's complex, and that's why there's not a single forage that I could recommend. And like Bronson was saying, it depends on the property, it depends on the time of year, it depends on so many other factors. And I think what I've learned most out of this is be diverse. Make sure they have a diverse array of plants, food, forage, whatever you want to call it. Make sure your property has the buffet. That way they can pick and choose as they need. That's what I've learned, I think. I think that'll disappoint a lot of people, but that's where it is, It's, diversity. Like we preach with a lot of other things. That's what's important.
Yeah, you're really managing for them to have a choice. Right?
Absolutely.
That's what you're trying to do. They know what they need better than we do. So let's give them choices and let them choose what's best for them. And that may even vary, like you were saying earlier, between individual deer. They you may have 2 mature bucks, and they may not need, or they don't need, exactly the same concoction of nutrients, right? There are individual variability even at that level. So I think that's just really cool, and I wish that we could just say, man, this is the best thing, go plant this. But you're right, that's definitely not the case, and deer show us that well. One thing I did want to add though, and we'll add this with the same caveat that we keep going back to. When you were looking at the nutrients and trying to figure out what was driving them to select things, it was pretty cool because your analysis actually showed that they avoid one thing, I think it was sulfur in this case, right? And then they secondarily were maximizing protein, I believe, for this study. Mm-hmm. Is that okay? Now, let's caveat that was in this context. I think we've said this over and over. Your deer on your property, wherever you're at, those listeners, this might not be the same thing, and it may be sometimes and maybe not others. But in this case, and during this study period, they were avoiding sulfur first, which can become toxic in herbivores pretty easily, and then secondarily maximizing protein. And that makes a lot of sense now, when we just kind of reflect on that. You can eat something poisonous once and it, end your life, right? That's a pretty important mistake. But most of us can stand to miss a meal or two and we're going to be all right. So I kind of think of it that same way with deer. It should be priority to minimize toxicity first and then secondarily meet nutritional requirements until you get to some limit where if they don't get a bite of this nutrient, they're going to die, which I don't think most deer are in that, even near that problem.
Yeah, for sure. And the deer...
Doesn't this help answer a lot of questions, though, that we have, even some of us old-timers, and by us, I mean Steve, some of these questions we've had regarding... you're up there recommending such and such forage, but I can't get them to eat it on my property. Well, now we can say, yeah, that's certainly possible. That in the context of my landscape, in the context of the naturally occurring plant community on my property, there are these particular nutrients that are limited, there are those that are abundant, and there may be some that you could reach easily at a toxicity level. But on your property that year, they may absolutely select for or avoid a particular forage, but because of those differences at more of a landscape level. So we were able to kind of take this and kind of retrofit it with a lot of the questions we fielded over the years. And I really believe, we'll always modify and change as we learn more, but I really believe that answers that question of novelty is also a new one. A lot of times a forage has to be introduced for a couple years. I mean, a deer has to eat it for the first time to get a feedback whether they like it or not and whether there's a toxicity or not. But once the forage has been exposed for a couple of years, then you can start to figure out again whether it's going to be a good forage to plant on your property or not. So
I think that's a great point, Bronson. And just, when we go back to the design real quick, Steve, sorry, all of these forages, the deer had access to those forages for a couple of years before, so that there weren't any novel forages, I don't think, in that mix. But I get this question a lot as somebody that's really interested in diet selection, and I'm sure you guys get it too. But there are a couple of plants, problem plants in particular, that I hear people arguing over, and they argue with me over it. And one of them, the native plant, is pokeweed. I mean, you can go to some properties and the deer will eat every leaf that they can get on, and then they'll stand on a stool to get the ones they can't reach. I mean, they're going to eat every leaf off of pokeweed that comes up out there. And then there are other properties where I don't see them eat it. Like, they'll just be pokeweed all over the place, and you just don't see them eating it. And I hear people saying that to me. And then there are a couple of the food plot forages. There are a couple of them. The one that comes to, or the group that comes to mind for me, are brassicas. And I hear some people say, man, we can't get them out of the ground because they just tear them up. And then other people say, they won't touch them. And I've even seen that variability across places that I've planted it. And I think you're right. I think this study was designed in a way that allows us to speak directly to that argument. It's like, well, you're not necessarily both right or wrong, right? We argue over which forage is the best all the time, but the reality is everybody is observing that in a different context, and you could both be correct or both be wrong, and probably you're correct and wrong at different times depending on when you're saying it, right?
Yeah, and I think it would be really easy for our listeners to get frustrated right now because they want that simple, give me a 30-second soundbite for what I should plant. And we're saying, no, there's no such thing. But there is, and Jacob made the point very clearly earlier, the key point is diversity. In terms of forages that you're planting, don't plant the same plant and don't just plant one season. Plant perennials, annuals, cool season annuals, warm season annuals, and a variety of forage types across your property, but then get out there and manage your habitat. And our Deer Labs have talked so much on previous podcasts and our YouTube channel about things like mineral stumps and prescribed burning. And Marcus, you have a new podcast just on fire management, so we refer people to that. And so there's a lot of things that we can prescribe in terms of improving diversity of plants across the habitat. So that's really important.
Yeah.
The third variable we haven't mentioned yet, Jacob, that I think you saw a negative association with was digestibility. The less digestible the forage was, they tended to avoid it. And that speaks to among other things, generally the age of the plant. They become less digestible the longer they're existing in their current life stage. And so that speaks to the need to get out there and manage habitat to stimulate plant phenology, or the stage of plant development, across the entire year. Don't just go out and plant a food plot in the fall and think you're doing something nutritionally for your deer population. It's about diversity and causing flushes of new growth. And some of our work, Marcus, under your direction, we're looking at timing of fire and how that created these nutrient pulses that were hugely attractive to deer. We've shown in other projects deer follow the nutrients. And they're going to avoid some of those aspects. So, Jacob, you've done a great piece of work, but that's, our buffet study isn't all that you did. You also looked at some other aspects of Soil phosphorus levels?
So this was actually I'm going to say it again, a super cool aspect of the project. So we did all of this that we've discussed so far, and then we wanted to take it a step further. So what we did is we selected 2 of those plants that we had used for the first tier of this study, and we planted them in different adjacent plots, and we wanted to see if we could change the nutritional composition of the forage by amending the soil, which is something everybody should be doing. Take your soil sample and follow the directions, apply nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium as recommended. So essentially that's what we wanted to confirm there and see if we could change the nutrients in those plants. So we had several plots of each of winter wheat, and then also what we did is we had these adjacent plots and we randomly assigned a treatment to them. So treatment 1 was application of lime, so working with the pH in the soil there. Treatment 2 was the application of NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. And then, of course, we had treatment 3 where we combined the 2, lime with NPK, and then we had a control plot. And so we did this, and what we looked at was we went in first and measured biomass. We wanted to make sure it didn't change biomass because that could, in fact, affect selection by deer. So we did, and we didn't really see many changes in biomass, but what we did see is deer were selecting the plants that had an increased phosphorus composition. So 1, we were able to amend the soil and actually have an effect on the nutritional composition of a plant. 2, deer somehow, even though to us the plants looked exactly the same, deer somehow were able to recognize that something was different between the plants, and they consistently selected those plants that had higher phosphorus concentration.
I also love that aspect. And just to be clear, we all really love this experiment if that hasn't come across yet. I love that because, man, I don't know. I know Bronson talks to people constantly, and I do. I'm more and more so now that I'm in an extension role, talk to people about food plots, and everybody's interested in what's the best plant to plant, and most landowners are planting some food plots. And the thing that I see skipped most often, that we preach about very often, is making sure you get that soil test. It's less than $10. Get the soil test and amend the soils according to that. And we traditionally have been telling people to do that to maximize the production of that forage, right? You're just trying to make the forage produce as best as it's capable. But what you show, Jacob, is the deer like it better. They actually want to eat more in the one that we amend to according to soil test. It's not just about producing more of the forage, it's also more attractive to the deer, which again is a really important thing for me personally as a hunter. I want to know what they want to eat the most, and amending the soil is not just about making sure the forage performs best, is secondarily is also extremely important for the selection or favorability or preference for that forage. And that's really cool that you did that. You had wheat and you did the same, had wheat in all the plots, but deer still knew which one you had amended and ate that one instead of the others, despite biomass or anything. They looked the same to us, like you said. So
yeah, and another cool part of that was that we planted some forages as well that had already senesced, so they had lignified. They really weren't palatable anymore. And so we wanted to make sure that just the act of pouring phosphorus and nitrogen and potassium on the ground wasn't attracting the deer more. So we did the same thing to forages that for all practical purposes were dead. The deer were no longer going to eat them. So we did the same thing. We applied those same treatments and the deer didn't touch them, which was more evidence that it was actually the change in the plant that was attracting deer. And it was the coolest thing because I remember standing there and looking at these, and you could not tell which one was treated with what unless you actually went up and read the label, So how they are able to differentiate between these things, I don't know. But they were, and they did it time and time again.
And let me follow up with another great example of what we were talking about earlier, space and time, what mineral or nutrient is limited. That's a great example. on this property, at that time, deer were selecting for the plants that had a greater concentration of phosphorus. We think is because it is relatively limited in that area at that time. So we're not sitting here advocating if you want to drive deer to your food plots, you need to go pump it with phosphorus. That's what we found because in our environment, we assume it's limited. It may be another nutrient. It may be another soil amendment that your $8 soil test may be able to enlighten you on that.
I think that's exactly right, Bronson. That soil test is telling you what's limited in the soil to grow plants. So amending it according to soil test should affect some of those nutrients that might be limited in the plant that they may need, and you're providing that by amending the soil by design, right?
Yeah, and
that's one other little tidbit. Sorry, Jacob. It's really hard not to talk over each other. But, I don't want to forget the point. It's basically the opposite of what Bronson just said. The other study where they were avoiding sulfur, we had a paired student, Don Chance, that was working out in the same areas, and some of his studies showed that a lot of the abundant plants that were in the well-managed forest around it were really high in sulfur. So the background sulfur on that particular area was high in a lot of the native forages. They were still really good forages, but the baseline of what they had available was pretty high, and we think that's probably why they then avoided that nutrient in the plots. So that's where that food plot can be a really good supplement to your other management practices.
Yeah, those are excellent points.
Something real practical too. Steve brought up a moment ago, and I guess we're all saying it, but diversity is key. We want a diverse, naturally occurring plant community. We're also recommending, if we want to give some management recommendations here, we want to recommend a diverse food plot system, but that's going to help you in two ways. I know in the past, a lot of, if you just go buy a bag of, quote, food plot mix, manufacturers will put a diversity of different plants in there from a strategy of they don't know where you're planting it. They don't know if it's going to be a wet year, a dry year. It just makes sense to provide a diversity of plants so you're going to have a good food plot. Something's going to come up. And so I would recommend that as well. If you're going to have 3 or 4 or 5 different plant species, it's also going to protect you from a particular crop failure versus you trying to plant a monoculture and it not working out. Jacob, you might remember we had some issues with rainfall. I think we had too much one year and not enough another. So it protects you in that way. And then also, assuming they all germinate, they all grow really well, ideally now you're providing the buffet for your deer during the times of years and for different individuals. So it's really a solid system. It may be boring for a lot of people, that there's just not this, pure 24 karat gold. Is this the one you should plant? You probably need to have 4 or 5 of them out there.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good point. And I have this conversation a lot with people, and the first thing I tell them is first, manage your property. Allow for your property to reach the full potential. But then if you're going to do a food plot, there's kind of two types of people that I see. One, that they don't worry about soil amendment whatsoever. The other, they're just going to buy 10 bags of whatever and they're going to dump it out. Both of those are equally bad in my opinion. If you're going to spend the time to plant a food plot, pay $8 to $10. And a lot of people, if they haven't done it, the analysis that you get back, the recommendations you get back are spelled out for you. Like literally, pour this much, pour that much. So if you're going to plant a food plot, amend the soil so that you allow the plants to reach their full potential. And that's what we saw. We did on our study site. We were limited with phosphorus, but once we made that available, the plants they completely took it up and we're good to go. So you start connecting the pieces, like with Marcus talking about Don's part of the project, and phosphorus high and then naturally occurring forages. They start fitting together really, really well. I mean, it tells a really cool story. So yeah, diversity is key. Make sure those first, give yourself high success rate, amend the soil, and then make sure you got a buffet of nutrients out there. The deer will eat what they want, what they need.
I tend, after this research, I make recommendations kind of like this, and we generally have to give the landowner, the manager, the hunter, we have to give them a little homework. First of all, we can't make any blanket statement about this should grow well on your property. I mean, they have to experiment with that. But what I typically do now, again, given this information, is I try to come up with, there are classes of forages, and I would recommend that you have one of the forages within that class as part of your diverse suite of forages. For example, you typically have 3 different cereal grains you can choose from. They all have some pros and cons a little bit. One of them grows a little bit better in the cold, one of them's not as cold tolerant, etc. But you got oats, you got wheat, you have cereal rye. Represent the class of cereal grain with one of those. Figure out which one grows good on your property. Ideally, maybe it's the cheapest one, but figure that out. Now, let's add a clover to that mix. You got lots of options. You've got different maturity dates. You have different costs. Figure out 1 or 2. For example, broaden your window. You might want to have an early maturing clover and a late maturing clover where you can cover 4 months with a high protein, highly digestible clover. Then throw in something like, sure, give a brassica a try as well. Adding that, maybe someone, I get this a lot. What about Austrian winter peas? What about this? And the answer is, sure. If it grows well on your property and the deer eat it, I have no problem with you adding it to your mix. So come up with 3 or 4 different plants within those classifications of a cereal grain and a legume and a brassica. Figure out what works for you, and I don't think you can go wrong with that.
Absolutely, and they've got it these days. It's so easy to look up these forages and see if you've got a property that tends to hold more water. Some forages are less water tolerant, some are more tolerant of drier conditions. It's easy these days to see what these forages need to grow. So if you've amended your soil to make sure that you've increased your chances of success, do a little homework, pick these forages that are going to grow well on your property. And yeah, absolutely, that was a great point. If you can make a food plot last for 4 or 5 months, absolutely. If you want clover in the spring that you can hunt turkeys over, that's, if you do it the right way, you can do that, and yeah, that was, you hit it on the head there. That's great.
Bronson, it just occurred to me when you were talking about people testing things out, that is a really good idea. A lot of people might want to see what's best on their property, and the best way to do that would be go buy a couple of different things. Maybe you have 4 or 5 different options. Most landowners, at least that I work with, or hunters, have some trail cameras. Go out there and set it up and monitor it and try to see which one's best. And that could even be something cool that we could try to do over a broader area with our listeners to try to get some consensus and see how things play out across that broader area if they wanted to participate in something like that. But I think you're hitting the nail on the head. And man, we preach this all the time about diversity in the forest plant communities or in old fields. But the same thing applies in food plots, and we should be thinking about this from the perspective of giving animals the chance to choose. Think about it that way, and the best way to do that is to have a wide variety of forages available for them to do that.
Yeah, and I would summarize the story here is kind of reiterating back to Jacob's comment earlier. Don't think about managing a food plot in a particular month. Manage your property for diversity across the time frame that deer need, and understand more about when they need it and what nutrients they need. Listen to all of our podcasts, look at all of our Facebook posts and things like that, learn more details. But it all comes down to one of my favorite movies, Field of Dreams. If you build it, they will come. And we've talked, because of your great work, Jacob, under the great direction of your committee, obviously. And, you've learned a lot of cool stuff. And plants matter to the deer. They're going to be searching and they're going to be chasing those nutrients, provide a diverse habitat throughout the year, and their needs are going to drive what nutrient they chase, and the habitat specific to a property is going to affect that, what they need. And it all comes down to generalizing. Diversity is the only correct answer in this case.
Absolutely. And one point I want to make for our listeners is we didn't do anything fancy. We did exactly what we preach. I can't tell you how much time I spent with a hand spreader, walking these food plots. I went to the co-op myself and bought these individual bags of seeds and lime and fertilizer. So, this is exactly what we preach, and it turned out great. So if you follow these steps, it's you can get some really cool stuff on your property. You can touch all your bases and really increase your chances of harvesting deer, attracting deer, whatever your goals may be. So, and lots of other critters too.
Well, Marcus, you want to kind of help our listeners. Where would they need to go to hear more about your Prescribed Fire podcast?
Yeah, so that's a good point, Steve. They can look at UF Deer Lab, and we have a bunch of content related to habitat management, wildlife management, deer management, and then we have a podcast that they can find via that, or they can search for Fire University or Natural Resources University, which the Deer University podcast is also a part of, and find those resources for those podcasts. So they're available on all the major platforms. We have it on the UF Deer Lab YouTube channel, and all the major social media. They can find this content. And just one more plug for that, we did make a video about this topic with Jacob that we'll have on UF Deer Lab and MSU Deer Lab. And also the National Deer Association just ran an article on quality whitetails, which they're going to make available for people if you want to see it in writing, that will be accessible at the same time as well. So hopefully this will be widely available to people in any form that you want it, whether you want to listen to it, look at it, or read it. It should be available to you.
And Bronson, you've done a great job of dragging me, the old guy, into the reality of the new world with podcasts and social media. They probably already are familiar with our MSU Deer Lab stuff, but you want to just quickly tell them where they can go?
Yeah, as always, website, msudeerlab.com, as well as our social media, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, search MSU Deer Lab. Also, as Marcus alluded to, our podcast network now, Natural Resources University, along with what Marcus is leading, Fire University. We also have Habitat University. So we do all things deer, they do all things habitat there. And for those, we talk about hunting all the time. We got a lot of these places that have a lease or property also have a pond. They're also interested in fishing. So they're in that network is Pond University as well, for people to learn about the very same topics we're talking about here with managing a deer population and managing a habitat. They talk about it on the aquatic side. So I think people will be interested in that as well. And I guess I'll say one thing in terms of balancing something terrestrial and something aquatic. Jacob Dykes is out in Baffin Bay, I think it was, outside of Kingsville, Texas, and you went to duck hunt, and like a good old Mississippi boy, I guess, you said, heck, I'm going to be in knee-deep water. I may as well take a fishing pole and see if I can sling a bait out there 50 yards away and see if I can catch something. What the heck is that all about?
Yeah, so it was it was an experience I'll never have again, I'm sure. But yeah, me and a few buddies went and decided we were going to see if we could find some ducks on Baffin Bay. So we, do like you do. It's an hour before daylight. We're putting out decoys and stuff. And I had my fishing pole with me. And I'd made a point, why not? We'll give it a shot. And so I also had a frozen mullet, which is a small fish that I caught in the surf like 3 months ago. Had it in the freezer, took it with me. And so I baited the rod up and I cast it out, right there with the decoys, and we're sitting in the duck blind. This is, like I said, about an hour before daylight, and about 5 hours later, the rod just goes to screaming, drag, taken off. I don't even think we had seen a few ducks, maybe missed the other people I was with, not necessarily me, but so
Of course.
So the rod is screaming, the drag is pulling, and so of course I take off with it, and I fight this fish for it's really shallow right there too, which was crazy, but fought this fish for probably 15-20 minutes, reeled it in, and it was a 47-inch redfish. By far the biggest fish of any kind that I've ever caught. But yeah, so I'm standing in my, waders, which are, grass camouflage. My duck calls are hanging off. I'm face painted, and I'm holding this redfish. And I've got pictures of it online, but it was the coolest thing. I'm standing in the decoys with this monster of a redfish. And I had one person comment and say, "Man, you really take your fishing seriously," when they saw me in the waders and everything. And I was like, oh.
Trying to hide from the fish?
Yeah, absolutely. Face paint and all. But yeah, it was such a crazy story.
I was hoping so much that you were going to say when you had that, you had the frozen mullet. I was hoping that you were going to say you just keep that in your waders just in case. or maybe one of your buddies stuffed it in there and you didn't know you had it or something like that.
Oh, I do now. Yeah, after this experience, I keep one on me at all times.
I'm gonna have to.
Yeah.
I'm gonna have to make a little room in my waders to keep some fishing bait. Is what I'm hearing.
It was unbelievable. Yeah, and it's changed, so I'll never be able to just go duck hunting again. So if you're around water, why not? Give it a shot. So yeah, it's what an experience it was, and yes, got some really cool pictures out of it. I don't know if we took a duck home that day, but I got my personal best redfish, and it was awesome. We watched it swim off among the decoys when I let it go. It was a really, really cool thing. So.
And Jacob, now you're pursuing your PhD at Texas A&M Kingsville, and your overall general topic is how do deer reconcile heat. Really, it's how are deer navigating the landscape, how are they using brush, cover, etc. to reconcile the tremendous amount of heat that they have to endure in South Texas. Did I describe that accurately, or do you want to add anything to that?
No, I mean you absolutely hit it. We've got GPS collars on deer and cows. We're looking at how behavior changes as it starts to get hot. And, the summer here is about 11 months long, so we have plenty of time to do this type of research. But yeah, we're wanting to see, how are these animals navigating the landscape? How are they behaving differently when it starts to get hot? And then also deer and cattle, are they competing for shade resources? So really cool stuff going on. It's starting to get hot here already. We're touching the 90s. So yeah, about to kick it off again. Yeah.
Well, good luck with that, Jacob.
Feel free to come and help me with field work this summer.
I'm going to make a note.
Yeah, let me get back to you.
It'll be about 100. There was a couple of days last summer, 118. So.
Yeah. Call me. We'll talk. Call me. Well, great. It's been fun and informative.
Yeah. Your project was cool, and just grateful, happy for you, Jacob. Thanks for all the work you did at Mississippi State at the MSU Deer Lab, and we're proud of you, happy for you. Support you in your endeavors now, working on your PhD. That's going to be a grind. We know. We've all been there. So good luck with that. Good luck with 11-month summer dealing with that. But great to see everybody. Thanks for everybody taking the time to record this podcast, and really enjoyed it.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Okay, everyone, I guess we'll sign off for now. Until next time.
We thank the Patrick F. Taylor Foundation and the St. John and Dudley Hutchinson families for their endowed financial support of our efforts.
We also thank our employers, the Mississippi State University Extension Service and the Forest and Wildlife Research Center. If you have questions or suggestions, please log on to msudeerlab.com and click on the Deer University tab.
Natural Resources University is funded by the Renewable Resources Extension Act. New episodes are released every Tuesday. For more information, follow us on our social media platforms at NR_University.